Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is the third book of the Bloodsworn Saga, and it wraps up this trilogy pretty nicely. So before we get too deep into this book, I'll talk a little bit about my experience with the trilogy as a whole. And I will say, unfortunately, this is probably my least favorite of the three. When I first finished the book, I probably had it in second place, and after I sat on it just a little bit more, I think I have to bump it down to the third place spot. Now that does not mean I think this is a bad book by any means. When you're going to rank stuff, something has to be in last place. And so for me, this one just didn't have exactly what I wanted out of it. Now, I think I'm going to be in the minority of that. I do think that a lot of the things that are delivered here in this book are going to be things that people wanted and are going to make a lot of people excited. This is a very action-packed book. And actually, this book reminded me a lot about The Rage of the Dragons, if you're familiar with that book by Evan Winters. It is pretty much go, go, go the entire time. I will say the emotional stakes here are definitely a little bit higher. I was definitely more invested in the characters here than, say, The Rage of the Dragons, but that does not mean that tone of just that go, go, go nature was not here. And for me, I definitely would have liked to have slowed down in a few different parts. I wish we had got to spend a little bit more time with some certain things. And unfortunately, because of the way this book happened, you didn't. And there's both a beauty in that and, like I said, a negative in that, because I think this book wants to make you feel a certain kind of way, and the way it is written, and just kind of you don't always have time to sit down and like breathe in these moments. And I think that is what this book is trying to do. And just for me as an individual reader, that isn't something that works for me here. I do think it is really well done though. And John Gwynne, it felt like he knew exactly what he wanted to do. It really seemed like he had this kind of planned out and knew what was going to happen. And so I definitely give a lot of praise there for that. I will say, going back to the trilogy as a whole, I think this is a really good trilogy for people who are not super into the fantasy genre. And I think something that is really refreshing about this book is obviously just the nature of it. This is a more Norse-inspired, or it is a Norse-inspired book. And I think a lot of fantasy has ignored that kind of history. And obviously there are some books that do go back to it, but getting away from like medieval knights and traditional witches and wizards and those kind of things, I did think was very refreshing. Now I will say I'm not somebody who has ever been overly obsessed or interested in Norse mythology. It's not something that's ever really called to me. It's not something I've ever really studied all that much, and that might be part of it. Honestly, some of the most exposure I have to that entire history is from these books, and then from like the God of War games that came out whenever, 2018 or so. So that is really like my extent of knowledge when it comes to Norse mythology. So I think if you are somebody who really enjoys that, this is definitely going to be a book up your alley, because there is plenty of stuff in here, and the magic is very cool and different, and just how some of that is handled, I think ends up working really well for the series as a whole. So what did I actually really like about this book? Well, I will say I do think it has some pretty good conclusions to arcs, which I think is always important. I could definitely see that this is a series or a world that John Gwynne could come back to. I know he did that with his other series where there's a sequel series that happens like 100 years later. I'm sure there's some connections there. I haven't read either of those series yet. I do plan on it, but I could definitely see this being a world where John Gwynne comes back to. With that being said, I still think it's important to not drag or leave any tendrils really that you don't get a good enough conclusion here. So all of the main characters, whether they're a happy conclusion, a sad conclusion, there's a variety in here, which I think is another thing that's really well done, is the variety of endings that do come. The fact that there are endings and there is conclusions for a lot of these things, I think is something for me personally I did enjoy, and I think other readers will enjoy. I know a lot of times people don't like that ambiguity, and I can totally understand that. As somebody who has finished series where it felt like the author definitely wanted to do more in the world, and then they either didn't get the chance or they did get the chance and I haven't gotten to this series yet, I can totally understand why people have some problems with that. And that doesn't mean every single chapter that is opened in this story is completely closed, which leaves a little bit to what I just said, maybe will upset some people. But I think the big ones that people are going to care about are definitely going to be, answered. I'm not going to say you're going to necessarily be satisfied, because that's very individual on what you like from your stories. But I do think that that is a real big positive here. I will say that this story is very family driven. From the very beginning, the main characters that I really cared about were very family driven. And even some of the other characters where they're not necessarily family driven, they have very heavy familial trauma and stuff going on in them. And so that is a trope throughout this that I did enjoy. There are some characters in here with what they're dealing with, I thought was done in a very tactful way, and done in a way that represents parts of humanity that we don't necessarily get to see. I'm specifically talking about one character, and this is going back to the first book, so not to spoil anything that's happening here in the third book. But Orca, when we're introduced to her, obviously it's her family that is driving her. Same thing with Varg, that's also going back to the first book. It's his family that is drawing him this entire time. So I think that is one of those themes that really resonated not only with me, but just throughout these entire books. It is such an important thing, and there's a bunch of different family things that are explored here that obviously, spoiler reasons, I can't get into, but I did really end up enjoying them. So I don't actually even know if I said this yet, but I did end up giving this book a 3-star rating, which for me means it is pretty good. But this is in general a book that I kind of have mixed feelings on, because while I did talk about the family ties and the characters that I did like, some of those characters I just cared about so much more than other ones. And even though we're getting different points of views, there were definitely times where we were getting points of views from characters where I was just like, I don't really even care which character this is. And there were times where I was actually mixing up who characters were for brief periods of time, just because so much of the cultures and the world here are the same. There's not those distinct things that really make them all that different. And so while there were I'll say 2.5 characters. Okay, so there's 2 full characters and then half of 2 other characters that I really cared about, which I guess comes out to 3 if you want to total them up like that. That's not all of the characters, right? And while there are supposed to be some very large, emotional, impactful moments, I don't know if it's because I took such a big gap between book 2 and 3, or if it's just I never really got all of the way there with those characters, which is what I think it is, because I remember when I finished the second book, The Hunger of the Gods, I really liked the book. I had a really good time with it. I think I gave that one a 4 stars, but I never really thought about the characters all that much outside of one specific character who I won't mention, to be absolutely spoiler independent here. But, that's a difficult thing. I'm not necessarily a character-driven reader, but I feel like these books were very character-driven. And so that is definitely one thing that was a little bit difficult for me. And I already kind of mentioned this, but there's some really big, long battle sequences in this book that definitely, it was so much that it was just too much for me. And that's a weird thing to normally complain about, right? Who doesn't like a good action scene? And John Gwynne, the action itself is so well done. It's some of the best action scenes that I've written, but just because they went on for so long and there's so much happening, it was just really hard for me to be fully invested in them the whole time. And I will also say that this is towards the end of the book, but the way some plot, it was almost like, okay, one plot thread is closed, another plot thread is closed, which, you have to, right? It's the end of the book. It's the end of the trilogy. You have to wrap these up. But it was very much at the end, okay, this one's done, now this one's done, now this one's done, now this one's done. It was very, I don't want to say formulaic, because it wasn't. And some of the things that happened were shocking, and I didn't expect them, and I liked some of those things a lot. But in the end, I don't know, I just have some very mixed feelings about what happened. Not even what happened, but just kind of how it was presented, maybe, when it comes to the end of this book. And so yeah, this series isn't going to go down as a new all-time favorite. It's going to be one that I think fondly of. It's going to be one that if there are sequel books for it, I will absolutely pick up and read, because I do think they are really well done. And I know that 3-star rating for a lot of people is going to be like, wow, that means you didn't like it. No, for me, a 3-star rating is a good book. I had a good time with it. I think it's good. I will recommend it to people, all of those things. It was just missing something. The first and third book here, they both got 3 stars for me, and there was just something throughout the series that was missing. And maybe that's a me thing. Like I said, it might just be that even though I thought the setting and the culture was interesting, since it's not something I'm overly invested in, it just, didn't bump all the way up. I'm not 100% sure what it was here. Maybe I needed more page time with some of the characters to really get invested in them. That could be it, because by the end of the series, I really only felt like I was invested in maybe one character, and not even the whole way with them. And so yeah, I think when I look back at this book and this series as a whole, it's a good series. I had a good time with it. I'm glad I read it. I would recommend it to people. It's just not going to be one that cracks into my top 10 of this year. Not going to probably be a series. I don't know. It could maybe be on the lower end of a top 10 series all-time list. Probably not. But that's the kind of realm that this book and series are going to kind of be for me. Overall, enjoyable. Overall, a good time, but just not anything like a new favorite. And that's fine. There's a place for these kinds of books in my own personal reading. I will say I really like John Gwynne and his sons as individuals, and so I want to support them, and I will read their stuff going forward, and watch their videos. If you didn't know, the sons have a booktube channel together, and one of them has their own individual one. And so I don't know, it's just one of those weird things where, because I like the people who are involved in this book, that like I'm almost a little bit more positive on it than if I was 100% completely neutral. And I think it's okay to acknowledge those biases. But in the end, if I really am honest with myself, I think this is just a good book, not a new favorite, but most people will probably have a good time with it in the end. But I'm going and rambling on a little bit here, so I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Let me know your thoughts of this trilogy and this last book in particular down below in the comments. I'd love to chat with you down there. But that's all for me, and as always, have a good one.